Ladies and gentlemen, before we start, could I ask you to please find your cell phones and silence them, please? Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Jeremy Collins. I'm the Director of Conferences and Symposia here at the National World War II Museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. It's a pleasure to see you all here today for our next installment of our longest standing public program, the Lunchbox Lecture Series. Before we begin the program, we'd like to take a moment to pause for a brief message from our sponsor, AARP Louisiana.
Hello, I'm Joanne Jenkins, Chief Executive Officer of AARP, America's largest membership organization serving people aged 50 and over. With more than 5 million of our 38 million members currently or previously having served in the military, we're in a mission to support veterans and military families. That's why we've created a wide range of free resources, tools, and community programs to help veterans and military families navigate their options and meet challenges head-on. We've developed a job board that directly connects veterans and military spouses to employers wanting to hire them. And we have free resources that provide some military structure to starting a business. We know that when you're a military veteran caregiver, you start younger, care longer, and face many unique challenges. That's why AARP provides a free military caregiving guide containing important and timely information that you truly need. Because military veterans or service members are twice as likely to be a target for fraud, the AARP Fraud Watch Network, in partnership with Operation Protect Veterans, provides free action alerts detailing the latest scams directed at veterans and military families. And through our state offices nationwide, AARP can help you find the right opportunity to give back to your community and fellow veterans. To learn more about these and other resources, visit aarp.org/veterans. Thank you.
Well, thank you to AARP Louisiana for their support for the National World War II Museum and for our veteran and military communities. Today's lecture is entitled Holocaust by Bullets in Ukraine, which will be presented by my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Popowycz, the Sherry and Alan Leventhal Research Fellow. Jen is the Leventhal Research Fellow here at the Museums Institute. She holds her MA in History from North Carolina State University, received her BA in History from Appalachian State University, and got her PhD from Louisiana State University right down the road. She reads German and Ukrainian and has held fellowships in Poland and Ukraine and specializes in Eastern Europe during World War II, where her research focuses on Nazi occupation policies in Eastern Europe, Ukrainian forced labor, and post-war population displacement. Without further ado, I will now turn the program over to Jen.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for everyone who is here today and all the online viewers taking time out of your day to hear me speak about the first phase of the Holocaust, which scholars call the Holocaust by bullets. I hope this presentation will shed light on a lesser-known aspect of the Holocaust and give you a sense of how quickly Nazi extermination policies radicalized and eventually turned into an industrialized machine of genocide. And before we get started, I just want to quickly mention that my colleague, Dr. Jason Dawsey, who is in the audience here, will be giving a Lunchbox lecture on September 7th about the lesser-known extermination camps in Poland, so please keep that out on your radar because I'm sure it will be a fascinating talk. On January 20th, 1942, top Nazi officials and representatives of the Reich authorities met in Wannsee, a suburb outside of Berlin. At this meeting, chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, the Reich Security Main Office formed the extermination plans for the final solution to the Jewish question. The Wannsee Conference, as it's now called, led to the creation of a network of extermination camps designed to systematically murder the entire Jewish population. However, before these killing centers opened at Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, more than 1.5 million Jews had already been murdered by the Germans, their Axis allies, local collaborators in Belarus, local collaborators. Also, this occurred in Belarus, Ukraine, and other USSR republics. These were the first victims of the Holocaust. They were not transported by trains to the famous killing centers in Poland with their gas chambers and crematoria that typically characterize the Holocaust in most minds of people. Instead, these victims were taken from their homes, usually by foot, to the outskirts of cities, towns, and villages where they lived, and were brutally shot face to face or in the back, often in the presence of local residents and non-Jewish neighbors. The mass shooting of Jewish victims in the summer and fall of 1941 represents the first phase of the Holocaust. It was during this initial phase that special German killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen units, murdered Jews by bullets with the help of the SS, Wehrmacht troops, the Romanian military, special operations squadrons, order police units, and local collaborators. And I just want to quickly mention this image here that I have on the screen. This is from a display that was showcased by the Museum of Latvia's Occupation back in the early 2000s, which is when the research into the Holocaust by bullets first started. And it shows some of the bullets that were excavated from a forest just outside of Riga by a group of archaeologists and historians. So here I have a map of Ukraine, and this map is obviously prior to the Russian annexation of Crimea and clearly does not take into account the war that's going on in Ukraine right now. But based on these borders shown here, 1 in every 4 Jewish victims of the Holocaust were murdered. And I'm just going to say that again, 1 in 4. It's a huge number, and it's often not something that's talked about or remembered in the minds of people when they think about the Holocaust. Before World War II, the 1.5 million Jews living in the Soviet Republic of Ukraine constituted the largest Jewish population within the Soviet Union and one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe. Between 1939 and 1941, when the Soviet Union occupied parts of pre-war Eastern Poland, which today, if you can see on the map, represents the areas of Galicia, Western Bohemia, Northern Bukovian, and Southern Barbarossa. The number of Jews in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic rose to almost 2.5 million people after they were fleeing German occupation in Poland, which increased the percentage of Jews by 5 to 6%. On the eve of Operation Barbarossa, or the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht and German police developed what the historian Dieter Pohl terms a graduated security system, which in effect meant alienating certain groups of suspected enemies. This policy was outlined by Hitler on June 6, 1941, so 2 weeks before the invasion, in a directive known as the Commissar Order, and demanded the swift execution of any suspected political leaders. And I just want to take a moment to read part of the Commissar Order, which I have here up on the screen. And it states, quote, "When fighting Bolshevism, one cannot count on the enemy acting in accordance with the principles of humanity or international law. In particular, it must be expected that the treatment of our prisoners by the political commissars of all types, who are the true pillars of resistance, will be cruel, inhumane, and dictated by hate. Therefore, when captured, either in battle or offering resistance, they are to be shot on principle. Just 2 days before the invasion, the Nazi leadership also issued a memorandum entitled Guidelines for the Conduct of Troops of Russia, which directly linked Jews as a racial group to the broader category of political enemies. These guidelines described Bolshevism as the deadliest threat to the German people's existence, justified the killing of Bolshevik agitators, armed insurgents, saboteurs, and Jews, and encouraged the total elimination of active or passive resistance. Thus, as the historian Wendy Lauer argues, and this is a quote, the German military helped prepare for the invasion by drafting and distributing orders for the ruthless isolation or elimination of individuals broadly defined as Bolsheviks and resistors and more narrowly identified as Jews. Both the Commissar Order and the Guidelines for the Conduct of Troops in Russia explicitly connected the threat of Bolshevism and communism to the Jewish race, reinforcing the highly propagandized Judeo-Bolshevik myth that communism was a Jewish plot to destroy the nations of Europe. More importantly, both directives also established a security policy of terror that sanctioned the mass killing of any group seen as a potential threat. So on June 22nd, 1941, more than 3 million German and Axis troops invaded the Soviet Union along a 1,800-mile-long front, launching Operation Barbarossa. It was Germany's largest invasion force of the war and represented one of the most powerful invasion forces in history. And I need to give a shout out to our senior historian here at the National World War II Museum who provided me with this map that he drew. He's great at drawing military maps, so thank you, Rob, if you're out there listening. As you can see from the map, Operation Barbarossa involved 3 army groups: Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South. Army Group South was the army that was tasked with invading Ukraine, capturing Kyiv, crossing the lower Dnieper River, and securing Crimea. And if you look at the very bottom of this map, near the Black Sea, you can see that the Romanian army was significantly involved in the invasion of Ukraine. And although I'm not really going to touch on it too much today, they also were explicitly involved in the Holocaust by bullets in the southern region. 4 commandos of Einsatzgruppen C, the security police and security service, followed the Wehrmacht's armies into northern and central Ukraine. SS Special Commando 4A swept through Volhynia, while SS Special Commando 4B moved through Galicia and Podolia. Behind the army was the Rear Army Group South. Although pre-war plans had anticipated the restriction of special commandos to the Army rear area, 6th Army High Command called SK-8 and SK-4B to the front lines, leaving security measures in the rear to be split up between the Wehrmacht, SS, and police forces. The division of labor between the SS near the front and the Order Police in the rear area Army Group South initially worked according to plan, but when the Germans reached central Ukraine, this division began to blur. And the term security measures encompassed a wide range of duties, but initially the main focus was the murder of Soviet political functionaries and perceived political enemies. In order to fulfill this goal, security task force were instructed to kill all Jews occupying state and party positions and target able-bodied Jewish men who might foment serious resistance on behalf of the Soviet state. And it's important to mention that, like, in this initial phase, only Jewish men were targeted because that's about to expand in about 2 months. Consequently, during the first weeks of the invasion, as German troops secured territory in Ukraine, large numbers of Jewish men were rounded up in cities and towns. Those who were deemed useful, such as skilled laborers, doctors, and specialists, were spared while the rest were shot. Local residents were often tasked with filling in the mass graves of these shootings. As large sections of the Soviet Union fell into German hands, the military assumed administrative control before a civil government could be set up. It was during this time that subsequent directives detailed the manner in which the Jewish population was to be exterminated. And this provides insight into how the Holocaust by bullets slowly, well, not slowly, kind of very quickly radicalized. In an order dated on July 11th, 1941, a commander of a police regiment in Belarus recommended that Jews be shot on the outskirts of towns and villages to shield local residents from the sights and sounds of mass murder. In order to, quote, erase the impressions of the day, the order also called for, quote, evenings of camaraderie to follow every mass killing incident. In the second half of July, orders for persecuting and murdering Jews became even more extreme. On July 21st, 1941, Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the security police, which also included the Gestapo and security service, began to encourage his special killing units to kill all military and civilian Jewish prisoners, not just those who belonged to the Communist Party or held government positions. And you can see Heydrich here on the left of the screen. On the right is Friedrich Yelkin, the higher SS and police leader of Russia South, and the personal representative Heinrich Himmler. He ordered his forces to kill anyone suspected of having, quote, abetted the Bolshevik system at the end of July, which, as I previously mentioned, because of the Judeo-Bolshevik myth, these two groups were explicitly connected. So I'm going to mention two sites of mass murder. One you're probably a little bit familiar with, but I'm sure you're not familiar with the mass murder at Kamianets-Podilsky. The massacre in the Ukrainian town of Kamianets-Podilsky was one of the first sites of mass murder during the Holocaust by bullets. And you can see here on the map where the city is located. This is a map of Eastern Europe prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union. And on the border, if you look down at the southern part of like Slovakia and Hungary, which is in pink, Kamianets-Podilsky is like right over the border. Of the 40,000 residents of the city, Jews made up about a third of the town's population. When German and Hungarian troops captured the town in early July, thousands of Jews fled east, but approximately 12,000 still remained. Shortly after the region was captured, government officials in Hungary expelled all Jews from Carpatho, Ukraine, and that's like also like right on the other side of the border, like the very eastern parts of Slovakia and Hungary in this map. And this region came under Hungarian control during the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939. Carpatho, Ukraine contains not only large indigenous Jewish communities, but also thousands of Jewish refugees from the Greater German Reich and Poland. As a result, by the end of July, more than 10,000 Jews from Carpatho, Ukraine arrived in Kamianets-Podilsky, the nearest town across the Hungarian border. The influx of thousands of people put a strain on the already limited housing situation and meager food supply. There were some diplomatic efforts to return Jews from Carpatho, Ukraine back to Hungary, but those failed. An army report from FK 183 described the quickly deteriorating situation. It stated, quote, the number of Jews were increased by the influx of Jews expelled from Hungary, of which some 3,000 have arrived in the last few days. Feeding them is proving enormously difficult. Danger of epidemic also exists. Immediate order for the evacuation is urgently requested. On August 25th, 1941, during a meeting between the High Command of the Army and the Reich Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories, discussed the establishment of a civil administration in the region. And these leaders divide what I would call an ominous solution to the problem, promising to liquidate these Jews before September 1st, 1941. The next day, on August 26th, there was a personally led action against the Jews in Kamianets-Podilsky. Since Einsatzgruppen-C's commandos were further east, Yelkin, who I was on the screen just a moment ago, called in the Police Battalion 320, which was reinforced by a company of ethnic Germans from the Baltic region. The first day, Hungarian troops and police units led 4,200 men, women, and children to the execution site where they were shot. According to eyewitnesses, the victims had to hand over all valuables, undress, climb down into a pit, lie down on the ground or on top of each new layer of fresh corpses, where they were shot in the back of the head. Witnesses also report that several Wehrmacht officers supervised the events from a nearby hill overlooking the killing site. The next day, Police Battalion 320 shot an additional 11,000 Jews. The mass execution only included the number of Jews, this first part of the mass execution only included the number of Jews from Carpathia, Ukraine, but also 2/3 of Kamianets-Podilsky's indigenous Jewish population still remained in the city. When the shooting stopped, Yelkin proudly informed the High Command of Army Group South, the highest military authority in Ukraine, that 23,600 Jews, including 14,000 Jews from Carpathia, Ukraine, had been killed. Although not yet a common practice in Ukraine, the Germans set up a ghetto for the remaining 4,800 Jews after the massacre. The mass killing of Jews at Kamianets-Podilsky represents the largest massacre of Jews in Ukraine during the summer of 1941. And it signaled a decisive shift in the Holocaust from targeting certain groups of Jewish males to the indiscriminate murder of entire Jewish communities, including women and children. This transformation continued throughout the fall of 1941 as tens of thousands of men, women, and children were shot to death in ravines, open fields, and forests throughout Ukraine. The second incident I'm going to talk about is the massacre of Babi Yar, which you may be familiar with because it's the most famous mass shooting in Ukraine that took place. And it's one of the sites of the largest mass shootings of Jews in German-occupied Europe. On September 19th, 1941, Jewish forces entered the city of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. Prior to the German invasion of the Soviet Union, there was an estimated 160,000 Jews residing in Kyiv, which represented close to 20% of the total population of the city. Once the invasion was underway, however, about 100,000 Jews fled Kyiv or were conscripted into the Red Army for forced labor. Those that remained in the city were mostly women, children, and the elderly. I took this photograph here that's up on the slide when I visited Kyiv in 2016. It's kind of hard to see, but the sculpture depicts like a group of falling Jews into the ravine. And it's a very powerful memorial to see, especially witnessing the scale of the ravine, which you can see from this photo. The immediate pretext for the massacre in Kyiv was a series of explosions in the Ukrainian capital caused by Soviet mines that had been planned to be set off as the German troops entered the city. These explosions destroyed German headquarters and many buildings along the main streets located in the center of the city. The blasts also killed a large number of German soldiers and officials. In many smaller Ukrainian cities, after the Wehrmacht secured control, Nazi officials registered, isolated, and forced the local Jewish population to clear rubble, repair roads, sweep for mines, and perform other labor-intensive tasks. This usually continued for several weeks before security forces began organizing mass shootings. In Kyiv, however, instead of utilizing German labor to repair the damage caused by the mine explosions, Nazi officials used the sabotage as a pretext to murder Jews who still remained in the capital. Some historians contend that the decision was made in coordination with housing authorities, since the fires caused by the mines caused an immediate housing problem. The Wehrmacht worked closely with the SS and police forces in Kyiv. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, under the guidance of Einsatzgruppen C, the SS, German police units, and their auxiliaries rounded up a significant proportion of the Jewish population in Kyiv and transported them to the ravine in Babi Yar, which is located just a few miles outside the city. The victims were summoned to the site, forced to undress, and then required to enter the ravine. Special SS units, under the command of Paul Blobel, shot them in small groups. A brief report summarizing the events states that on September 29th and 30, SK4A, in collaboration with Einsatzgruppen headquarters and Police Regiment South, executed 33,771 Jews. And the really interesting thing is that at least 40 copies of this post-action report were distributed in Berlin to the SS, the Wehrmacht, and high-ranking Nazi officials. And since reports such as these were routinely copied, read, and discussed in detail, the 1941 mass shooting that was being conducted in Ukraine was well known throughout the Nazi government and party circles. And so in the immediate aftermath of Babi Yar, just a few days after this mass murder of Kiev's Jews, Hitler issued an order of the day to the Eastern Front, which described the Soviet Union as a system created and controlled by Jews. Hitler's call to troops read, and you can read with me because I have the quote up on the screen, "In a country that, owing to its vastness and fertility, could feed the whole world, poverty rules to such an extent that we Germans could not imagine. This is a result of nearly a 25-year Jewish rule that, as Bolshevism, is basically similar to the general form of capitalism. The bearers of this system in both cases are the same, Jews and only Jews." A week later, Field Marshal Walter von Birkenau, the highest-ranking army official in Ukraine, reiterated Hitler's message in a subsequent security order for troops in the Eastern territories, calling for soldiers to, quote, "accept and carry out severe retribution against the subhuman species of Jewry." The directives by Hitler and Reichenau clearly demonstrate how the Holocaust rapidly escalated in Ukraine. Within a matter of months, orders calling for the murder of Jewish males with communist ties expanded to include the indiscriminate murder of women, children, and entire Jewish communities. The radicalization of Nazi racial policy continued throughout the war as new methods of extermination were developed. And so those were two of the major sites of mass executions. But in addition to these large-scale massacres, there were hundreds of smaller mass shootings in towns and villages throughout Ukraine, with the number of victims ranging anywhere from 100 to 3,000 in each location. After the war, the Jewish Preservation Committee of Ukraine identified 495 such sites, but a more recent estimate by the Catholic Jewish organization Yad in Unam, sorry, my Hebrew is absolutely terrible, puts the number of mass graves at 916. Here you can see on the map some of the major sites of execution produced by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, but because of the map scale, not all sites are shown, and especially we don't really know exactly where all the sites are. There's still being a lot of research done to excavate forests and ravines in Ukraine still today. The extraordinary work by Father Patrick Dubois, who interviewed hundreds of witnesses in towns and villages throughout Ukraine, reveals a general pattern of how these smaller mass shootings unfolded. According to Dubois, the way the massacres took place depended on different circumstances: topography, the presence of partisans, different facts that the Germans had to weigh to perpetrate the most rapid and efficient assassinations as possible. However, certain characteristics were common to all mass shootings in Ukraine. The testimony of Nikolai Olkusky is characteristic of many of the accounts obtained by Dubois describing these smaller mass shootings. In describing one site in Ukraine, he stated, quote, "There were people of every age, children, old people. They had been told to gather because they were going to be taken to work somewhere, and that they should take some food and their children because there would be nurseries in which they would be looked after. The Jews had a sort of armband. Then they were told to undress, and they were thrown into pits. At the end of the day, I went to look. The earth was still moving, since many had not died right away." Local policemen, an embassy from the mayor, or a German official also requisitioned non-Jewish civilians to dig pits, fill in mass graves, collect Jewish clothing, and sort through Jewish valuables, pulling out teeth and transporting Jews in carts to be buried. The requisitioned were mostly young men, women, and children, or adolescents, who were not only present at the event, but had also been forced to participate in mass murder. And I feel like it's important to note that although there were local people that were forced to participate in especially the cleaning up of these mass executions, there were willing local collaborators that willingly participated in these actions as well. So there are several reasons to help explain why the Holocaust by bullets and the study of the Holocaust in Ukraine, it remains a lesser known aspect of the Holocaust. First, Holocaust studies only established itself as a field in the early 1990s. In the beginning, the field tended to focus on anti-Semitism within the highest decision-making levels of the Third Reich. Secondly, Auschwitz syndrome, or the tendency among historians, philosophers, political scientists, and the general public to focus on the killing centers where an estimated 3 million men, women, and children were gassed and cremated in an industrialized, systematic fashion, also drove scholarship in the early stages of the Holocaust. In this way, and this is according to the historian Wendy Lauer, Auschwitz became the central symbol of modernity, derailed the nadir of Western civilization, which inevitably led scholars to neglect other places where the Holocaust unfolded in a different way. Third, until 1991, scholars lacked access to the regional archives in the former Soviet republics. During the Cold War, Soviet officials sought to repress most discussions of the unique fate of Jews under Nazi rule. Instead, Soviet scholars examined the suffering of all peaceful citizens, which undoubtedly included the destruction of the Jewish population, but also focused on a wide range of non-Jewish victims. And according to one historian, this manifestation of Soviet anti-Semitism guaranteed that the archives in Ukraine and other successor states remained closed until the Soviet Union collapsed. Today, the killing sites in Ukraine are practically undetectable. As Paul A. Shapiro writes, these places offer up none of the architectural design elements that shape the iconic imagery of the Holocaust memorial sites worldwide. Our Bachmike Fry, encased in ironwork, the curve of the arched gateway to Auschwitz-Birkenau, or the chimney of a crematorium. Many of the Jewish victims murdered by the Nazis remain invisible as well. According to the central database of Shoah victims' names kept by the Holocaust Remembrance Center in Yad Vashem, about 50% of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust by bullets still remain to be identified. And I have these two contrasting photos up here on this slide because I think it really shows why we tend to think about the Holocaust more as killing sites, because a lot of them still exist, just like Auschwitz. You can go, you can see it. And then on the other side, you have an excavation of a site in Ukraine where, I mean, there's not much going on. No one's going to come visit it. So I think seeing the photos side by side really demonstrates why we think about the Holocaust in certain ways. Although there is no architecture of destruction at the killing sites in Ukraine, the first Jewish victims of the Holocaust did not simply disappear from the face of the earth, and the Holocaust by bullets is crucial to understanding how the Holocaust developed. For every echelon of the Nazi regime, the summer months of 1941 mark a transition from uncertainty to certainty, as policies aimed towards the male Jewish population quickly expanded to include entire Jewish communities. Moreover, it was after shooting Jewish victims en masse that the German policy towards Jews took a fateful turn. Mass murder by gunfire took a cumulative toll on German soldiers and proved inefficient in achieving goals aimed at exterminating all Jews. It was the experience of the failures of the Holocaust by bullets that eventually led to the decision to shift to an organized, systematic murder of Jews in the form of industrial extermination camps. Thank you. And while we do Q&A, I'm just going to put some resources up here if anyone is interested in learning more about the Holocaust in Ukraine. Most of these books you can get on Amazon, and they're not super expensive. So.
Thank you, Jen. We have a couple questions online from Andal, who was one of our fellows at our 3-week summer seminar we just hosted here that wrapped up last week. How has the memory of the Holocaust evolved over time in the Ukraine?
It's a really good question. For a long time, I think, like many post-Soviet countries, the focus was not just on Jewish victims, it was on all victims of Nazi occupation and extermination policies. I will say that the Nazi government did kill hundreds of thousands of non-Jewish Ukrainians as well. And I think a lot of Ukrainian historians, both in Ukraine and the West, tended to focus on that. But there has been a shift to, and this is largely like the work of Wendy Lauer and Omar Bartov, to really focus on the Holocaust and separate that from other victims in Ukraine, because it was a completely different situation. So it's involving. It's hard given current political situation in Ukraine to say for sure. But like other places in Eastern Europe, there is a tendency to still focus on like non-Jewish victims.
If there are any questions in the audience, please raise your hand. But the next one comes from Lee, who's watching on Vimeo. Is there a list of the victims of these mass shootings?
So there's a list of about 50% of them. You can find them on probably Yad Vashem's website. I know that they do have a list. I'm not sure if it's open to all researchers or if you have to like physically go there, but yes, there is a list of about 50% of them.
Don't be shy. We've got a question here in the back.
My question is there a specific website to see resources specifically about the Ukraine killings?
I would recommend the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Oh, okay.
You can actually go and search their collection. If you type in Holocaust in Ukraine or Holocaust by bullets, they actually have several like short videos, and there's a lot of information there. They also have just like general articles that just kind of explain the basic facts of the Holocaust in Ukraine. Great resource, highly recommend it.
And I heard conversation before the lecture started. That third title there, In Broad Daylight, was just on sale for a Kindle e-reader. The next question, coming from Andal again, what kind of reactions did you get when you met with Ukrainians and told them about your research?
So my research, I started my research focusing on forced labor in Ukraine, because my grandparents were actually Ukrainian forced laborers that worked in Nazi Germany. So the response there was that everyone was super excited that I was researching that topic. I've kind of switched to the Holocaust, and I unfortunately haven't really talked to many Holocaust scholars in Ukraine. And I hope I can go back sometime soon. But yeah, initially, Ukrainians are very excited that anyone is doing research on Ukraine.
In the back here?
Today,
You speak into the microphone.
oh gosh, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but today, with Russia occupying Ukraine, what are the thoughts on being able to continue the research after whatever happens there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't think anyone really knows the answer. There are other archives that you can go and visit. The National Archives actually have a lot of copies of microfilms of documents obtained when the U.S. invaded and the U.S. liberated Germany, and when the Soviet Union did. We have a lot of copies of that in the National Archives. Yad Vashem is an amazing source for research. You can search a lot of their collections online digitally. Same thing with the U.S. Holocaust Museum. In terms of going back to Ukraine, I'm hoping that the repositories are not destroyed, because there's still a lot of research to be done.
And just some inside baseball, we've had a couple of speakers for museum programs that have halted their work. They were not able to come for appearances because they were actively busy helping their friends and contacts at the onset of the invasion. Next question in the front row here, Jen.
I'm just making sure I understood you correctly. Did you say the reason so many of us don't know about Holocaust by bullets is because the research didn't start till 1990?
Well, so Holocaust research in general didn't really start until 1990, but the Holocaust by bullets research didn't really start until the early 2000s. Yeah, and if you're interested in how that research started, I would highly recommend Father Patrick Dubois' Holocaust by Bullets book. It's a very easy read, and that's actually where we get the term. And what he did is he had his grandfather was actually a French soldier, but he was imprisoned in a POW camp in Ukraine. And so he wanted to go back, I think this was like in 2001, to just see where his grandfather was imprisoned. He ended up talking to some local Ukrainians there and started a project about researching and excavating these sites. And he developed a team of translators, archaeologists, like Army specialists to conduct over, I think it was over 400 or 600 small mass shooting sites. I mean, highly recommend that book. It's amazing. Wendy Lauer's, that's the last one on there, The Ravine, also goes through a specific process about trying to figure out the story of one specific family.
As another aside, 60 Minutes did a profile on Father Dubois, I think, when the book came out. It's a quick story and great, and I think I may have stolen the question.
Yeah, there's also, too, just like before you answer that, the U.S. Holocaust Museum also has several interviews with him that you can watch online as well.
Okay, my last question is, why do you think the Ukrainian Holocaust was not so talked about as much as like Auschwitz and, you know, all that?
I really think it's because there is no visual representation of it, and a lot of the witnesses, if you think back, I mean, especially when they started doing this research in the early 2000s, the witnesses were children when they witnessed these atrocities. So it was very hard to find people who wanted to talk about it. The repressive aspect of the communist state probably had them fearing to talk about it as well. So I think it's going to expand. I think the research is going to expand, but I think it's going to take a little while for it to be more of a well-known aspect of the Holocaust.
Jen, it's my turn, and obviously you and I share a real interest in this topic, and we managed to depress everybody who's in our section of the Institute when we have
Yes,
these conversations. There's a book I think many here, certainly people interested in the Holocaust know, called Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, and it really deals with a police battalion in Poland involved in the mass murder of Jews, and many of these policemen were described by Browning as not really fanatical Nazis. The reasons they killed, Browning explored things about peer pressure and kind of group identity, and there was a whole variety of things that he argued were there. But in the case that you're looking at here, Jen, these are not those type of men, these killing squads that you're looking at here. What could you tell us about the type of people that are staffing these murder squads in Ukraine, also in Belarus, also in the Baltic states? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know specifically about staffing, but because like Einsatzgruppen was highly involved in this and they tended to be more fanatical Nazis, I think you have a different experience. There's also a lot of interethnic tensions in Ukraine, so there were a lot of local collaborators that were very much willing to engage in mass murder of their Jewish neighbors. And as you know, it's a very long history of interethnic tensions in Ukraine. But I think it's a little bit different. I mean, there were also like members of the Wehrmacht that participated in this as well. that would be a great book to to do like a Browning take on what the Wehrmacht soldiers in Ukraine thought or felt about it. But I mean, they were involved, so I feel like I can't make the conclusions that Browning does without doing the research. But I think maybe in this case, especially when you're having these orders from your leadership and you're literally conducting an invasion, and so there are enemies everywhere, whether it's because they were Jewish or they had all this propaganda about Jewishness is an enemy. I think being part of it, like an invading force, definitely had something to do with it too.
Next question comes online from Katie Popowycz. Don't know if it's any relation.
That's my sister.
Were Jewish specialists kept alive at first to be of help to the invading troops?
Yes, there were like Jewish specialists. If you were a skilled laborer initially, you were often made to do forced labor. I'm not sure about like doctors, but I would suggest doctors or anyone with any kind of like skill that's needed to assist. They were probably made to work with Germany.
Next question from Joel. Is there an effort to update history curricula in K through 12 schools to place more emphasis on the Holocaust?
It's a great question, depending on if it's even taught in high school. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely in some of the current environment and talks about anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe still and in the U.S., I think it's very important to try and incorporate as much as you can in high school curriculum. I would suggest going back to the like archives. Yad Vashem has educational information. U.S. Holocaust Museum has education for K through 12 teachers. I would recommend looking at those because they probably have a very, I guess, it can teach it in a way for a younger audience. And there's some great tools. There's like learning objectives. There's like activities you can do. So I would suggest checking those out.
And if I may plug our website, if you Google World War II Museum Holocaust Resources, you'll get our topics page where a number of articles and pieces from our curricula that we send out, our curriculum packets to schools across the country and teachers. I think there's a question here towards the front.
Yeah, hi. I've been interested in this since the early 90s. I happened to visit at least a dozen villages and towns in Belarus and Ukraine where Jews used to live, and every place had a story about people being rounded up and taken to usually a forest just outside. And so I've been wondering, why don't more people know about it? And one thing I should mention is the first place I went was in Ivya, Belarus, which is a small town near Lithuania. There was a theatrical presentation done by an American daughter of people from there. And she had done research in the 80s. But I went with her to a meeting in Brooklyn of the Ivya Society, and there were a lot of survivors who got together in groups and wrote down their memories and met. There's a lot of oral histories. I mean, I hope that researchers like you will become aware of those and find them.
Yeah. There's a lot, and I mean, you have to be like a researcher or make an appointment, but Harvard University's Ukrainian Research Institute has an amazing archive of oral histories from former forced laborers and Holocaust survivors, if you speak Ukrainian. Some of them are in English, but most of them are in Ukrainian.
Right, and good. And in the bigger picture of history, besides just the Holocaust, Americans barely know anything about the entire Eastern Front and the victory of the Soviet army over the Germans. And is that going to change ever?
I mean...
or is it changing, let's say?
I think it is changing. I think especially with the opening of the Soviet archives in the early 90s, you really saw an explosion of scholarship from Soviet historians, but also Western historians who were able to go over and access those documents for the first time. So I think it is expanding. You just have to know where to look for it. And if you want, I can give you my card, and I can give you bibliography after if you want.
Another question from online. Bill wants to know, how were the victims identified after so many years?
Yeah, so I think this is the reason why so many haven't been identified. They've been trying to do DNA tests on some of them. They have been able to identify some victims, but if there's no DNA record from family members, then it's obviously you're unable to identify them, and that's why so many are still unidentified.
Any other questions from the audience here? We have one in the back row, Jen.
Yep. Thank you. After World War II, how many Jews returned to Ukraine, or what is there a number prior to the invasion of Russia? Thank you.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I know that there was a huge Jewish, a lot of Jewish, not just Jewish Ukrainians, but Jewish Poles and other Jews from other Eastern European countries fled to Germany, and they stayed in Germany, and many immigrated either to Canada or United States because they didn't want to go back, because the Soviet Union had their own anti-Semitic views as well.
Great. Oh, we have another question.
Thank you so much for the talk. I guess I'm curious because we're here in the World War II Museum, and what I love about this museum is the way that it portrays the stories of various people who participated in the war from the American side, specifically. And I was curious, because of the museum's popularity and its influence, whether stories from allies would ever be shown. For example, like a story of someone who was involved in the Soviet Union on the Soviet front.
Yeah, so we're actually opening a Liberation Pavilion next year, I think is the date that's set. And we are going to have a lot more information about the liberation of Germany from both sides. And then also we're going to have an exhibit on the Holocaust. And so we're going to have oral histories from those who were survivors of the Holocaust.
As America's National World War II Museum, our mission is to tell the American experience, but we do, through programs like this, our conferences, special exhibitions, we do incorporate those stories, but the majority of what our visitors are going to see is through the American lens.
Jen, let me just thank you for a great presentation, and just a comment. Because I think for a lot of people, there's always a question about what happened to these perpetrators, right? There's thousands of these men and these murder squads, and you mentioned Paul Blobel and showed the map of Ukraine involved with the Babi Yar massacre in 1941. It's interesting that Paul Blobel and Otto Ohlendorf, who commanded Einsatzgruppe D in southern Ukraine and the Crimea, they're two of the very last Nazis to be executed by the United States. And that's not until the summer of 1951 that they're put to death. Thank you.
Yeah. Very important point.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Dr. Jennifer Popowycz.
Thank you. Yep.
Well, thank you to you all. Thanks to Jen for an incredibly informative lecture. Thanks to AARP Louisiana. If you liked what you saw and heard, or if you learned from it, I don't know if we really liked today's topic, but if you learned from it, please pay attention to our events calendar for upcoming programs. Like us on Facebook and you'll get updates. And you can also see almost all of our past programs on our YouTube page. So you can go searching there. It's a great resource. Until next time, have a great afternoon and thank you.